Alrighty, first off, I'd like to say welcome. Thank you for taking time out of your day to join us today. My name is Craig Blaze Fiero. I'm our COC Programs Coordinator here at Texas Homeless Network, or the Balance of State, whichever you're more pertinent to. As we go through here, if you'll take a moment, drop in the chat where you're coming from. We lost our map, so I'm still working on a way so we can interact with the map, but I do want to know where y'all are coming from. So drop where you're coming from in the chat, and I'll walk us through our basic intros. So again, this is the general meeting for August. Here we go. For those of you that are unaware, all that orange space you see in front of you, that is the Texas Balance of State. We take over 215 of the 254 counties of Texas. It's approximately like 86 something percent if I did my math right. The Texas Balance of State is the continuum of care for most of Texas, or the rural parts at least. We develop system level responses and coordinate local community strategies to prevent and end homelessness around the rural areas of Texas. Anybody's invited to join the general meetings. Most likely the information that's coming here will be pertinent to those in homeless services, but we do want other sectors to be involved so we can share most of this information across those ways, so those inter partnerships can be formed. We will be changing kind of what this meeting looks like throughout the year, so be on the lookout for those updates as we let them be shared. For those of you that have never seen us, and I'm sure there's quite a lot of you since it's grown since I've been here, I think I started when there's 9. I think we have 32 of us now. So this is only half of us. This is the other half of us. We're growing ever so slightly as we go along. And of course, for more information, always keep an eye out on our website. We're always posting relevant information there. All of our social medias, and of course the newsletter link, which I'll be dropping into the chat here shortly. Moving us ahead, we will be having our pit conversation with Alex Paredes. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm going to hand it over to Alex.
All right, thank you very much, Craig. Can y'all see my screen? It should be working, right?
Yes, works perfect.
Cool, let's go ahead and get going. So as y'all probably know, my name is Alex Paredes. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the data coordinator here at THN. So welcome to a quick little pit training. Let's go ahead and dive right in. So we're going to start with some point in time calc basics. We're going to go into some information about THN itself and the geography that we cover. We're going to talk a little bit about the methodology behind the pit count. We'll talk a little bit about the HIC. And then at the very end, we'll have some wrap up and some question and answer. If you guys have any questions at any point during this presentation, please just go ahead and drop it in the chat. We're going to address it all at the end. Okay, diving right in. So here's some of the questions that the pit count aims to answer, as well as the definition of the pit count. So the way I like to define it is the point in time count is an unduplicated count on a single night of people in a community experiencing homelessness. So the other way I like to explain it is that the pit count is the minimum number of individuals experiencing homelessness in your community on a single night. Okay, so there are 4 main reasons that we conduct the pit count represented here in this graphic. We conduct it for awareness, so we can advocate to local governments and raise community awareness of homelessness. To understand the extent of homelessness within our communities, understanding those trends over time and the characteristics of those who experience it. We can also conduct it for funding, as we can use our pit count data to both advocate for local funds as well as federal funding. And for engagement, as we can use the pit count to develop personal relationships with those who experience homelessness and create a shared sense of responsibility with a various degree of stakeholders. All right, so we have to talk just a little bit about COVID-19, unfortunately. So at this time, we have not received word from HUD regarding COVID-19 and the 2023 pit count. So if y'all didn't know already, in 2022, we were able to return to conducting both a sheltered and unsheltered count, and we plan on doing so again in 2023, as long as it is safe to do so. We can't predict if there's going to be another variant or spike in cases, so as we approach the count, we will have a better idea of what that is looking like. The safety of everyone involved is our #1 priority, so we're going to keep an eye on that situation and update you accordingly. But for now, we're going to move forward, assuming that we are going to continue with our sheltered and unsheltered count. So in the meantime, we plan on working with each community to ensure that volunteers have access to PPE, such as masks, gloves, hand sanitizer. We recommend as a best practice to keep up with CDC guidelines and reach out to me if you have any concerns about accessing PPE. All right, so here's a little slide about some information on THN, our organization. I'm not going to go over this slide too much in depth. I just think it's valuable to include a slide detailing what THN does, as well as clearly explaining the difference between the two divisions of our staff. We have the Texas Balance of State team, which focuses on those 215 of Texas's 254 counties, while our statewide initiatives team focuses on efforts all across the state and coordinates directly with other COCs. Great, so here are two maps to help visualize the area that we covered in the last full pit count in 2022. So as you can see on the right, we have the Balance of State map with our counties highlighted there in blue, our 215 counties. And on the left is our 2022 pit coverage highlighted by the dots on the map. You can see those green, yellow, and orange dots. So in 2022, we were able to cover about 74% of our COC's entire population. So about 26% of our COC did not have any pit coverage in 2022. All right, so this graphic is just a simplified list of the primary tasks required for a successful pit count. As you all start planning and training your volunteers, you'll receive more specific and detailed guidance. Main things to remember are to select a pit lead. So every community is going to need 2 pit leads, and actually you won't be able to complete the sign-up form without a backup pit lead. And then community engagement, we want to stress that that should be occurring throughout the entirety of the process, from beginning to end. And training, which is something that I will be facilitating as well. And you will need to decide as a community what structure works best for you. But of course, I will be there to help volunteer training whenever it is needed. You just need to give me maybe a couple weeks heads up and I can help with that. And I'll also be posting several trainings online, so you can access them at any time. All right, so how about let's go over a little overview of the count itself. So our count is broken down into 2 pieces. We have the unsheltered count and the sheltered count. So that unsheltered count, we are looking for people in locations such as streets, outdoor encampments, and other places not meant for human habitation. And then we have our sheltered count, which includes us looking for people in emergency shelters, domestic violence shelters, transitional housing, and hotels or motels paid for by an agency voucher. So let's keep that in mind as we talk a little bit about who not to count. So I think it's also important to highlight those that we do not count under HUD's definition of literal homelessness. So we don't count people who are residing in permanent housing. So that includes people in permanent supportive housing or rapid rehousing programs, HUD VASH, as well as FEMA projects. And we also do not count people in temporary living situations. So this includes people who are at risk of eviction, maybe doubled up with family or friends, in a hotel or motel paid for out of their own pocket by their own funds, as opposed to an agency voucher, which we would count. And other temporary living situations like a shelter for foster care, a halfway house for sober living, and criminal justice or health facilities. So by that, we mean something like a jail or a hospital on the night of the count. Okay, so now is the point that we are going to shift a little bit and talk a bit about the housing inventory count. So the reason I think it's important to have these counts in the same presentation is because they happen simultaneously and oftentimes are analyzed together. So for those that aren't familiar, the HIC is the annual count of beds and units designated to serve those experiencing homelessness. So it includes both emergency shelter and transitional housing, which are counted for the PIT, but it also includes rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing beds, which are things that we do not count in the point in time count. So a simple way to remember this is that the PIT measures people and the HIC measures housing. And when you look at them together, it demonstrates the scope of homelessness in your area, as well as your capacity to respond to the crisis. All right, to take things one step further, here is a graphic to demonstrate the similarities and differences between the sheltered PIT and the HIC. I won't go through each bullet point, but to give a quick summary of this graphic, the key differences are that the PIT requires individual surveys of each client residing in the emergency shelter or transitional housing program. And each of those surveys takes about 25 to 40 minutes to complete, whereas the HIC only requires you to fill out one form for each housing project your organization has, which takes about 10 to 20 minutes total. They are both required by HUD. They both happen at the same time, and I provide technical assistance for both. So the PIT is driven by local leads with support from THN, and the HIC is driven by THN with support from local leads. Okay. All right, so here are some of the takeaways and the main lessons that we learned from the most recent 2022 HIC. We're currently working on some fixes for these, but some things that we are considering are more assistance needed to onboard those new programs and those new housing projects, encouraging shelters to conduct their count immediately following the PIT count so that their data matches. We want to find a way to keep programs involved throughout the year and keep them engaged, understanding the difference between the PIT and the HIC, and the importance of participating in both of those counts. And if you're participating in HMIS, we want to work on ensuring that your data in HMIS matches for both the PIT count and the HIC. All righty, let's go ahead and move on to a quick poll question. I'm going to go ahead and launch this poll. All right, so we are looking for y'all's input on the upcoming 2023 winter PIT count date. We have a couple of options here. We have Thursday, January 26th of 2023. We have Friday, the 27th, and we have Saturday, the 28th. And there's another option as well if you have any other dates in mind. So I'm going to leave this going for maybe a minute or so, and we'll see what we got. All right, it's looking like Thursday is kind of taking the lead right now, with Friday coming in a close second. All right, sweet. Well, thank y'all for that input. It looks like our winner is Thursday, January 26th, which is probably likely when it's going to be anyway. So thank y'all for giving us some input on that. Let me go ahead and share those results with y'all. Okay. Let's go ahead and move on. Okay. So here we have a couple of takeaways from the 2022 PIT count. So when it comes to our most recent PIT count, our primary takeaways from 2022 are that we here at THN could do a better job of providing training and assistance directly to shelter programs, as well as providing more intentional outreach in advance of the count. Some other takeaways were making sure that volunteers understand the importance of selecting the correct region when filling out the survey, strategically timing shifts so that surveys occur when participants are most likely to engage in an interview. So, while they're not eating when they're most likely to be willing to engage in that survey. Strategically, oh yeah, no, I already mentioned that. My bad. Okay, limiting survey shifts throughout the day to minimize duplication, and having pit leads notify THN of any unique circumstances prior to the day of the count, so that y'all can help us anticipate any data quality patterns. Yeah, let's go ahead and move on to some updates on the 2023 pit count. So we have some exciting updates on how we're going to be conducting training. So we're going to be conducting pit lead training online via a training course. And then there's going to be a pre-count webinar on how to use our data gathering app and regional command center. And then there's going to be a post-count webinar on how to read your data. So there will be a pre-recorded training released in December for volunteers that can be accessed at any time. And for anyone conducting volunteer training a bit earlier, we will be releasing a training template in September or October. So in addition, if you can give me, like I mentioned, if you can give me a few weeks notice, I am 100% willing to conduct a virtual volunteer training if that's something that you're interested in. I am more than willing to help y'all with that. And we will also be providing training for our sheltered counts as well. So there's going to be a series of additional presentations posted to the THN website to help engage providers in pit count. And this includes surveying different subpopulations such as DV survivors and veterans. So that will be posted around some point in November. And I would also like to mention that we will be having a sign-up form in early December for individual community check-ins if you're interested. If you need any additional guidance as we go into our January count. And we'll also be holding some office hours style conference calls. We're planning on doing about 3 or 4 of those towards the end of the year and the beginning of January, where anyone can come in and ask questions and receive guidance. All right, so how about a quick little tentative timeline? All right, so around September, we're going to have our deadline to join the count. So we are going to be releasing a sign-up form in the chat pretty soon after our Q&A that has a link to sign up for the point in time count to be a pit lead. And remember, you need a secondary pit lead in order to join the count. We'll also have our pit leads begin assembling their committees, and then we'll be finalizing our pit date. So around October is when we will be having a mandatory pit lead training course. We will be finalizing our shelter list, and we will begin mapping unsheltered locations. Around November, we will have our pit leads begin volunteer recruitment and community engagement. We will have our mobile app training webinar, and that webinar will also be posted online so you can view it at any time in case you need a refresher. And then we will have our deadline to sign up for a service-based count or a paper survey, as well as our office hours support calls begin. And then around December, we're going to continue volunteer recruitment. Pit leads and communities can sign up for one-on-one support calls, and refresher materials and supplemental materials will be released. And we will also have those volunteer videos trainings be released as well. Okay, so now's the time where we're going to take a quick little break and see if we have any questions in the chat.
Yeah,
Alex, Nancy was asking, could you say more about matching HMIS info to the PIT and HIC info?
Yeah, so if you participate in HMIS, we recommend that you continuously update the beds, because sometimes, you know, for those counts, we require a utilization rate number. And so this number is essentially just a PIT number within that housing project. So sometimes we can get data from HMIS that has those utilization rates, And sometimes those numbers are consistent. So we're going to try to work a little bit to make sure that those numbers in HMIS between the pit count and the HIC are consistent. Do we have any others?
Nothing that I saw yet.
Yeah, so mainly it's just making sure that like those numbers are matching. And because the pit count, yeah, gathering that data of the amount of people in a shelter, and the HIC count, we're measuring the utilization rate in those beds. Cool, I'm glad that helps. Awesome. Any other takers before we move on? Again, if you have a question later on, I'm going to be sticking around in the meeting. I'll also be staying behind a little bit in case any of y'all want to chat, talk a little bit about the pit. Okay, that's okay.
Hey, Alex, I have a question. This is Mary.
Hi, Mary.
If there's a new community that has never done a pit count before, what should be their first step?
I would say their first step is to email me. Let me know you're interested. You don't have to sign up immediately. There's plenty of time to sign up. But it's working on making sure that y'all have the capacity to do so, and maybe connecting with your local LHC if you are involved in one, if your county is part of an LHC. That's a great question. Thank you for that, Mary. All right.
Alex, a question came in. Are you going to put out a flyer for community engagement?
Yeah, I'm working on that right now. I'm working on creating a flyer for community engagement that y'all can use. You can post on social media. You can use that as advertisement to get your communities involved. And community engagement, that involves utilizing a lot of different aspects of your regions and your communities, whether it's your local church or your city officials. It can be a multifaceted approach. And yeah, I'm here to help with that as well. That's a good question too. Thank you so much for that one. All right.
That looks to be it.
All right, well, let's go ahead and move on real quick. So I'm going to post in the chat real quick our sign up form for the pit count. Let me pull that up. Boom, there y'all go. Okay, so that is our sign up form for the 2023 point in time count. Again, you have until the end of September to sign up. So we're thinking probably September 30th will be the deadline. So if you don't know who your pit leads will be, you don't know who your secondary pit leads would be, I recommend bookmarking this page so that you can bring it up when you feel like you're ready to sign up. And also, let me post this resource real quick in the chat as well. This is a resource to help you start recruiting for your pit count committee for your communities, if that's something that y'all might be interested in. What if you can't get a second? Well, I would email me if you have concerns about that. We can definitely work through that and figure something out.
Alex, can you go back to the timeline slide?
Oh yeah, sure. Craig, can people download this this presentation?
Yeah, once you're done, I'm going to drop it into the chat pod so they can download it.
Awesome, yeah. So go ahead and download this presentation too, reference it, utilize those links. Yeah. Cool. All right. Well, that's about it for me today. Again, my name is Alex Paredes. I'm the data coordinator here at THM. The best way to reach me is to email me at alex@thn.org with any questions. We'll be working together throughout the next 4, 5, 6 months. So I'm looking forward to seeing all y'all throughout the year. All right. Thank you all very much. I'm going to go ahead and stop screen sharing and pass it off to Mary and Jim for our community conversation.
Hey everyone, this is Jim. I'm the Director of Planning here at THN. I'm joined with Mary. We're going to talk to you all about the COC plan to serve people experiencing homelessness with severe service needs. If you don't know what we're talking about, that's okay. We're going to kind of give a brief background. But before we jump into that, Mary, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. I'm Mary Stalkey. I'm the Director of Engagement for the Balance of State COC at THN. And I work mostly with our board of directors and our strategic plan. And now with this new pool of funding.
Great. Thanks, Mary. So Craig, can you drop the PDF version of these slides in the chat if you've not already done so?
Just did.
Cool. Thank you. So in the chat now, folks can download and follow along. There are a ton of slides in this section of the meeting. We're not going to spend a ton of time on every single slide. This is intended to be a more participatory part of this space. So if you have questions as we're going through this content, please drop it in the chat. Craig will interrupt me, or you can come off a mute or ask Craig to come off mute and just kind of speak, your question or your feedback. So without any further delay, I'll go ahead and get started. And I apologize in advance. My slides are not as, what is the word?
Fancy?
Yeah, they're not as fancy. They're kind of bland. They're kind of bland. We've been working pretty hard on the content and have very little time to get through this stuff. So let's just go ahead and start moving. So today we're going to talk about the supplemental NOFO. That might be what you're here for. Hopefully you're here to learn about the continuum of care and how to end homelessness in your community. But if you want to learn about the COC program supplemental NOFO, you're in the right place. We're going to talk about the plan. We're going to talk a little bit about your feedback. We're going to talk about the COC priorities that are coming from your feedback and will be part of the COC plan. And then we'll talk a little bit about next steps. So where is all this coming from? On June 20th, HUD released what they were calling the Supplemental Notice of Funding Opportunity to address unsheltered and rural homelessness. You may hear it referred to as the special NOFO or the supplemental NOFO. I will tell you it does not feel very special because of the timelines, but we're really excited that there is about $67 million available over the next 3 years to assist communities in the balance of state to address unsheltered and rural homelessness. That should not be confused with saying at the end of this process, we are going to have $67 million for the next 3 years, but that is our hope. And we are operating as if we try hard enough, we will be able to realize that goal. What a more likely scenario is something more than zero, but less than 67 million. So part of that supplemental NOFO is that every COC must develop a comprehensive plan to serve individuals and families experiencing homelessness with severe service needs. We've shortened that to the COC plan, so you might see it referred to as a COC plan. It should not be confused with the COC's current strategic plan, which has been in operation or has been a part of the COC strategy since 2021, and it was kind of came out of the gaps analysis that was conducted in 2020. But this will be incorporated into the COC strategic plan because it fits under a number of the goals of the strategic plan. A really important thing for applicants to know is that if you're planning to access any of that $67 million, HUD is really looking for coordinated efforts. And coordinated efforts means that applicants are submitting applications that are consistent with the COC plan or that align with the COC plan. versus come one, come all, bring your ideas, and let's see what we can bring to the COC. They're really looking for something a little more coordinated. They've said in some spaces, quote unquote, out of the box thinking. And I don't think we've got anything in this plan that's too out of the box. I think most folks will find that the things in this plan make sense. So talking about what severe service needs are, service needs can be any combination of significant challenges or functional impairments, high utilization of emergency services, vulnerability to illness or death, a continued or repeated episodes of homelessness, or a vulnerability to victimization. And then additionally, currently living in an unsheltered situation or having a history of living in an unsheltered situation. And so the intent of this plan is to meet the breadth of people that you might find that fit this definition, right? It's not for one group or for one type of person experiencing homelessness. It's intended to give the communities a framework to respond to homelessness in their community. So we wanted to talk a little bit about the plan development so far. So as I mentioned, the NOFA was released on 6/20. On 7/13, we had our first informational webinar where we solicited feedback from the folks that were in attendance at that webinar, and started the basis of our feedback for the plan itself. Following that webinar on 7/25, we released a survey, and I'm happy to report that at this point we've received more than 100 responses to that survey. And then once that survey is actually still going, so you can still complete the survey, and we will strive to incorporate your feedback if it's not already incorporated into the plan in some way. But we are kind of approaching the point where we need to start finalizing the plan. And speaking of the plan, we released a draft of this document on 8/2. It's up on our website. The links to access the plan itself are here in your PDF copy that you downloaded, as well as a way for you to give us written feedback about that plan. And then on 8/3, we hosted a feedback session, and I'm seeing that I dropped the G and the close parenthesis on this slide, and so I apologize. But that feedback session was recorded. It was our first big Zoom event. I think it went really well. We got a lot of great feedback from the folks that were in attendance that day. And then today we're talking about it at our general membership meeting. So at that meeting on 8/3, what we did was we really spent a lot of time on areas that we didn't feel like we had enough content for. So we didn't go over the plan in great detail. We didn't talk a lot about the feedback that we were getting. But today we're going to talk a little bit more about the feedback that we've been getting. And I just want to kind of acknowledge before we get too much further into the sections of the plan itself, overwhelmingly the feedback that we got was that there's not enough housing resources, and there's not enough housing resources in any community. And so I think that makes the need for this plan that much greater, a need for a local plan to be able to coordinate and implement culturally appropriate strategies that will resolve someone's housing crisis as soon as possible. Will it bring more resources to the table immediately? That is unlikely. Do we hope that it will bring more resources? Absolutely, that is the goal. But just wanted to kind of acknowledge the fact that by and large, the feedback that we got was, we have an idea about how we can resolve someone's housing crisis really quickly, but we don't have access to the resources to be able to do so. So I just wanted to say that before we kind of go further into the sections of the plan. So we're going to talk a little bit about the plan itself, the priorities that we are proposing in the plan, and then the individual sections itself. There are 7 sections, and then we're going to talk a little bit about next steps. So before we go too much, well, I think I've said before we go too much further, like 5 times, let's just get into it. So the plan is intended to be structured enough, but flexible enough for our community to tailor at the local level so that, you can develop a project application that aligns with the COC plan, but still retain the local autonomy to be able to to implement that plan with your partners. We are pretty happy with the participative planning process that we've gotten thus far. We've had a lot of really great feedback from all over the state, and there's a slide in here that's a really cool graphic about where all that feedback is coming from. But I think that there is a section in the plan itself that talks about the feedback that we've gotten, who gave us feedback. More or less, it represents the demographics of the balance of state, with a couple of notable exceptions in terms of race and ethnicity. Overwhelmingly, the respondents to our feedback requests were white and Black. So not a lot of other diverse experiences represented. But otherwise, in terms of age, sexual orientation, there's a pretty good mixture of folks. And then the COC's priorities themselves in the plan represent our strategy to address unsheltered homelessness and meet those severe service needs. So this slide, I just really like the way it looks. I've probably been working too much, but this is intended to represent the counties that participated in the development of the COC plan. So as of right now, we've gotten representation from at least 83 counties out of our 215, which is more than a third. And if you think about some parts of the state of Texas, how sparsely populated they are, to get 83 different counties participating in this is something that's really, really exciting for us. By and large, there's a few communities that really showed up in terms of providing feedback, and that is Denton County, Taylor County, so Abilene, Texas, and then Bell, so Temple and Killeen area. So thank you all so much for providing your feedback. But thank you to everyone that's participated. If you're here on this call and you participated in it, we're really grateful for the feedback that you gave, and all of it is valuable. So the plan priorities, right? I think one of the things that we're hoping to communicate through the plan is this community-wide commitment to reducing unsheltered homelessness. I think we can all probably recognize that homelessness is too big of an issue for one agency or one organization or one COC. It really is something that requires a community-wide commitment to reducing unsheltered homelessness. We are proposing that folks that want to access these funds will need to leverage housing or healthcare resources. This is kind of I'm on a lot of like national calls with other COCs, and this is something that I'm kind of excited about. And we're gonna talk a little bit more about that when we get to that section of the plan. But in addition to leveraging housing and healthcare, folks are gonna need to have a landlord recruitment strategy. Applicants to this pool of funding will need to have Soar trained staff, and we'll talk a little bit more about what that means and how we can support y'all in that. Obviously, HUD's really big on housing first. That has not changed. They came in really heavy with the housing first language on this application, and they would expect that all projects utilize a housing first principles and practices. I think at THN we would agree. There's a lot of information in the plan about street outreach, and street outreach is a kind of a funny thing in a rural COC, right? There's a big chunks of our COC where there is no formalized street outreach, and so the street outreach that exists is informal, and it may not be connecting people to shelter or housing, primarily because we know that the resources don't exist. But just kind of setting some framework for what street outreach is doing in a community. So for example, street outreach is not accountable to a single agency, but rather accountable to the entire community. That said, there still has to be a recipient of the funds, and that recipient is accountable to HUD. But really, what we're looking for here is community-wide buy-in. It goes back up to that first bullet point. Street outreach should be strategic and culturally appropriate. We have some more content on culturally and linguistically appropriate services a little bit later on in this presentation, which sounds a lot more technical than it actually is or can be. And then again, HUD would expect, and I think we would agree, that street outreach exists to connect people to shelter or housing, whether that be temporary shelter to resolve their immediate crisis through like bridge housing in a hotel or motel paid for with a voucher, or it be enrollment into a rapid rehousing or permanent supportive housing, or reconnecting them with family or whatever. I think one of the things that we're going to be looking for projects in this NOFO is that there is a strategy that can be communicated and is understandable by someone to be a housing strategy connected with the street outreach project. I think it should kind of go without saying, but all of the projects that will be funded under this opportunity should serve or target people living in unsheltered locations or with histories of unsheltered homelessness, or people with any combination of severe service needs. So that could include survivors fleeing domestic violence or trafficking. That could include people with severe functional impairments due to disability. But we need to focus our energy on the folks that are least likely to be able to resolve their homelessness and that are the ones that are going to kind of languish on the streets without intervention. Another really important part of the COC priorities is that persons with lived experience are involved in the project design, service delivery, and decision making. And I think that is something that came both from feedback, but also from HUD's expectations for this NOFO. So that is something that we'll talk a little bit more about and give. There's information in the plan about the COC's progress toward that end. I think that's, again, like a lot of things, a continuum, right? There's a lot of different ways that you can engage people with lived experience in your organization or in your community. And really what we're saying is that we want to see that increased. And then underserved communities are identified and served. So underserved is kind of an interesting one, and we'll get to this a little bit later on in the presentation, but underserved, we know who underserved communities are. These are the folks that you know are experiencing homelessness in your community, but you just are unable to reach them. Either the services that exist are not appealing enough to them, or there's some other disconnect between the population that needs assistance and the services that are being offered. And so we want to try to bridge that gap. We talked a little bit about the class. It's actually culturally linguistic appropriate services. And strategies are developed as part of that effort to identify, engage, and house those folks. So it's the plan is broken down into 7 sections. Each of the sections kind of has its own priorities. However, there are some kind of plan-wide priorities that we were hoping to communicate in this space and get feedback on, and that is the community-wide commitment to reducing unsheltered homelessness, the use of housing first principles. So whether it's a street outreach or a permanent supportive housing project, the idea that housing first principles would be employed in the implementation. That idea that projects funded under this initiative are targeting those that are most that are living unsheltered or with histories of unsheltered homelessness, or have that any combination of those severe service needs. Engaging, again, people in lived experience in the project design, service delivery and decision making, and that we're identifying those underserved communities and developing strategies to address those gaps. Mary, I feel like I've just been kind of rattling on here for a while. Is there anything that you would add to what I've said already, or that you feel like I missed?
No, nothing that you've missed, but just maybe as a breather for everyone who hasn't been so engrossed in this as you and I have. We know this is a lot of information. We're hoping that it's the consistency across the plan is coming through in this presentation. It's really about reaching people who are living unsheltered or have histories of unsheltered homelessness, or any of those severe service needs that Jim showed on the slide. So if you have questions, know that we are, looking at this thoroughly, and the plan is reflecting what you've said, what we know we've seen in the COC, and we're hoping that a lot of communities and agencies will apply for this funding. This is a great slide because it is some of the main priorities that cover all aspects of the plan. So you'll see these concepts woven throughout all the sections. And then as we continue, we'll get into some more section specific priorities. But these are the ones that, again, go across the entire plan and really reflect the purpose of this funding.
Thank you, Mary. So the first section of the plan talks about leveraging housing resources, and it asks a lot of questions about the COC's current strategy for the development of new units and creation of housing opportunities, both at the COC level, but also at the local level. It also asks about landlord recruitment, like what landlord recruitment strategies has the COC employed over the last several years. And so we asked not those questions verbatim, but asked similar questions throughout this process to folks that responded to the survey. One of the questions that we asked was, what resource do you think would be most valuable to you as you're developing a project application to this funding type? And the selections were varied from public housing authorities down to, affordable housing developers. And what we found in collecting that that feedback was that the most common response from both nonprofit service providers or homeless service providers, mainstream partners that filled out the survey, and even community members was that there's already strong resources in communities generally, and that is public housing authorities. I think that lines up really well with HUD's, what HUD has been saying in terms of the PHA's role in addressing homelessness. I know that I've had some conversations with PHA's kind of one-off in terms of like what their role is in the community's housing crisis response system. HUD's put out a lot of really great technical assistance materials about how PHAs can get more engaged. And so we were not surprised necessarily to see that the most common response there was public housing authorities in terms of how an applicant would be able to develop new units. And Nancy, I see your question in the chat, and no, it is not too late. In fact, we haven't even started talking about when the application is going to open. So thank you for that question, but no, it is not too late. Again, many communities have PHAs, but not a ton of other housing resources, right? Especially rural communities. We know that no one is just like fallen over themselves to invest in rural communities. And that is a shame, to be honest. Mary and I were on a call with a group called Texas Rural Funders earlier today, and it was just so reinvigorating to hear another group that is focusing on rural Texas. But the fact remains that in a lot of communities, a PHA and maybe a couple of nonprofits are really it as far as, well, that's not true, right? Like we have church groups, we have all kinds of informal supports. But in terms of like formal structure that HUD would recognize as, a critical component of a housing crisis response system, PHAs really rise to the top. And so we are proposing to incentivize our relationships with PHAs in this process. I'm not going to go way in depth in that. I would encourage you to read the plan because I'm long-winded and I'm running out of time. But just know that the development of new units is a priority through this funding opportunity. Additionally, landlord recruitment. The reality is we don't have a COC-wide landlord recruitment strategy, right? That is such an individualized and localized activity that it really makes sense for communities to have landlord recruitment strategies. And so we tried to spotlight communities' successes in the plan, but we think that that's going to be a common theme, is like identifying where we want to replicate things, and then trying to see how, if we can spread that to other parts of the state. So you can see here real quick, 2 bullet points: leverage housing resources and having a landlord recruitment strategy, I think, are what we would look to folks for with this funding. Section B is similar but different enough that it requires its own section, and that is how applicants and COCs will leverage healthcare resources to improve health outcomes and housing stability. So we asked that question, or a similar question, about who in your community do you think you would be able to partner with to leverage resources to support folks in these projects? Overwhelmingly, the responses that we got were LMHAs, substance use disorder treatment services, and healthcare systems. So things like hospitals, clinics, or healthcare providers. We are implementing that into the strategy for how we are identifying applicants for these funds. And so we will be looking for applicants to partner with LMHAs or any other healthcare provider to support the health and well-being and housing stability of the participants in these projects. I recognize that's not enough detail for someone to really go off of, but again, I would encourage you to read the plan because I think it'll become a little bit more clear. The headline here is, if you've got a healthcare partner that you've been working with, maybe that's been informal, now might be a really good time to start formalizing relationships with your healthcare providers. And I did want to just clarify that it is either housing or healthcare at the project level, not both. So we're not saying to you that you have to have both housing and healthcare leverage, although you could. We're asking folks to identify their strength, and then let's leverage that strength for the benefit of the folks in these programs. Some important notes is that, if you do decide to leverage healthcare resources, you cannot limit the eligibility for your project based on the requirements of the healthcare provider. So for example, if they'll only take folks with, I don't know, United Healthcare, you can't say that we're only going to accept people into the program with United Healthcare. So I just wanted to point that out. And you do also have to comply with fair housing as a part of this. So you can't limit it to specific disabilities. For example, you couldn't say we're only going to serve people with type 2 diabetes because I got a killer deal on insulin and we're going to be able to leverage all of that insulin. No, that's you cannot do that, but you could use that as part of this process. You just can't, I just want to clarify what I just said. You just cannot limit the eligibility for the project based on that. So the other thing that I don't think we fully captured on this slide back here is Soar, which I mentioned earlier on in this presentation. But Soar stands for SSI, SSDI Outreach, Access, and Recovery. And it is a nationally accepted technical assistance approach to help folks that are living that are not necessarily unsheltered, but they're living in homelessness or at risk of homelessness, access SSI or SSDI in an expedited way. It's got about a 65% success rate, which compared to the trends on self-navigated SSI or SSDI claims is just astronomical compared to some of the statistics that are out there for accessing those resources. We are going to host a webinar on August the 16th. The link is in this slide. It's also on our community training calendar. And we would encourage anyone that's thinking about this opportunity to apply. And I see that there is a question in the chat. Is that fundable with HUD, like Healthcare Navigator with SOAR training? That is 100% fundable through the supportive service budget line through this opportunity. So yes, you could fund this position exactly the same way as you would a holistic case manager. It would just go to a little bit of a different part of the budget. So, but yeah, that's a great question, John. And we're going to talk about that more on the 16th as well. So not only what SOAR is, what to expect in terms of if you're gonna go after this, we would expect that applicants do go after it, but really the way that you can structure your application to make sure that that is not an unfunded mandate. So Shamika asked, if someone already has a SOAR certification, do they have to do it over? No, they would not have to do it over. If you have SOAR certified staff at your agency already, they would not have to do the self-paced training. SOAR has changed a lot in the last few years, and so now the trainings are all self-paced and it's all online, but there is a refresher. I know John's attended the leadership training. But yeah, if you have folks that are already SOAR trained, no. Now, what I would say is we would ask that you not add this to someone else's job description, because we know that SOAR is significantly more time intensive than just telling someone to go fill out an SSI or SSDI application or doing a couple of forms. So we're going to talk more about all that on the 16th. And Nancy asked, will there be a general info meeting for the 2022 NOFO? Yes, there will be. And there will be more information about that in the very near future.
Hey, Jim, there's a question
yes.
from Kelly. The reality is that we work with our PHA. They recently had to stop taking any applications as their wait list is 5 years long. That would mean we would not be competitive if they have to provide 50% of the housing units. Do you have any ideas?
Yeah, so I don't see that question in mine, but I might have just not scrolled up enough, but
It's in the
so
Q&A pod.
okay. Yeah, so part of this whole deal is that your PHA may be getting what they're calling housing stability vouchers. And so I don't think that means you won't be competitive. I think if you do not have a relationship with your PHA, then you could look to relationships with other housing providers. Headline here is we're looking for leveraging of additional resources to this funding opportunity. It could be either housing or healthcare. It does not have to be both. Those organizations that are able to pull both together will have the strongest application potentially, although not guaranteed. And I don't anticipate that there are going to be very many of those organizations. So hopefully that helps, Kelly. I do want to move us on just because we're talking a lot about or I'm talking a lot. Excuse me, I'm sorry, all the dogs are about to freak out. I am so sorry about that. She was just lying there asleep, and then like something possessed her, and she just jumps up and starts shrieking. So Section C is a big one. Section C covers, as you can read on the slide, the COC strategy to identify, shelter, and house people experiencing unsheltered homelessness. The plan itself really focuses pretty heavily on street outreach, but the way that they focus on street outreach also carries into housing interventions. And the reason for that is because there's a big focus on that intersection between identification and housing. And so a lot of the plan is kind of centered around this idea of street outreach, but if street outreach doesn't exist, I mean, you can be thinking about it and how, you know, what does the identification process look like when there's no street outreach, right? Like that's something that, you know, we're kind of struggling with as a COC, given that there is no COC-wide strategy for street outreach. But so I think one of the things that we kind of coalesced around was this idea that street outreach is strategic, and you can read the bullet points on the slide. I would highly encourage folks to read the plan. On the 8.3 feedbacks session, we got a lot of really good feedback about street outreach that is happening and what street outreach that is successful is doing. But in essence, you know, these 5 bullet points, I think, really kind of highlight successful street outreach. And that last one, I don't think can be overstated, and that's hiring people with lived experience to actually do street outreach, not in a tokenizing or an exploitative way, because I think folks need to be paid a living wage for their skills and time and, you know, livelihood. But really, you know, working to meet people where they're at and engage in this idea of culturally, linguistically appropriate services. And that really involves, you know, this culture both of continuous improvement and accountability. So if this is not something that you're currently doing, like, that's okay. Very few people in the COC right now are doing all of these things really, really well. Obviously, the intent of street outreach is to identify the most vulnerable, prioritize unsheltered households and persons with severe service needs for what emergency lodging and permanent housing does exist. But I think one of the things that we haven't really talked about with street outreach is this idea of that community accountability. So there's 2 different kinds of street outreach, right? There's street outreach that's connected to a housing project and that's funded through the supportive service line item of that housing project. And then there's a standalone street outreach program. And when we're talking about a standalone street outreach program, we're talking about something that exists for the benefit of the community, even though it's administered by one agency. When we're talking about street outreach that's connected to a housing project that exists for the purpose of identifying people for that housing project, that's a little bit of a different kind of a different beast. And so what we're talking about right now is that standalone street outreach component that's eligible for funding under this opportunity. This was a really interesting part of the survey for us, because of the folks that responded to the polls, the surveys, gave us their feedback, approximately 60% of them said that they do strive to provide immediate access, but all respondents, virtually all, said that more access to shelter and greater coordination is needed at the local level to be able to really match the demand, and it's not a demand, but match the need with the supply with the need, right? It's all about matching and being as efficient and strategic as possible. Mary, any thoughts, any questions from folks that are hearing this maybe for the first time?
Yeah, just a reminder that we've talked about street outreach, again, is not sort of an end unto itself. It really is a means to get people into housing, immediate access to temporary housing or immediate access to permanent housing. And as Jim said earlier, we know that access to housing in your communities is not meeting the need, but as much as we're able to find partners in the community, this project gives money to fund the project. So there might be people in your community that are a housing developer or Habitat for Humanity or some other group that's already involved in housing that would be interested in partnering with you, knowing that this pool of funding is incentivizing those community partnerships. So street outreach connected to housing.
Yeah, so I think in the plan itself, it's broken out into 3 different sections. One, identification, access to temporary housing, and then access to permanent housing. Again, about 60% of survey respondents said that they provided immediate access to permanent housing, but that there is just not enough housing available. So we're really anticipating, hopefully, a lot of housing projects associated with this, but where there is street outreach, I think that there, we have some pretty good priorities for folks to align with. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this because I am, again, kind of going over with my words. But if there are any questions, please drop them into the chat just to make sure that we see them. But again, street outreach should have access to housing resources, both temporary and permanent. So not that you supply the access, but that it is a coordinated effort at the community level. Section D looks at the strategies described in Section C and how we'll update them using data and performance. So part of this section actually asks us to give information about the projects that will be proposed for funding, which obviously we don't have yet since we haven't opened up the application. So that section will be incomplete for the immediate short term until the application process is complete. But how we'll do that is basically through HMIS coordinated entry, like how we're adding new partners to the system, how we're getting folks housed, like are we, through our system performance measures, seeing any measurable reduction in the length of time homelessness that someone is experiencing, or through any other number of HMIS generated data points, and then through local kind of qualitative data via CE and case conferencing. So, we hope to engage communities in the development and implementation and evaluation of projects, and we're going to talk a little bit about that in Section E. But we are hoping to really lean into this idea of continuous improvement. We don't know everything that we're going to need to be successful with this. We don't know, again, who the applicants are. So it's really challenging to say, a definitive what data and performance priorities will exist in terms of like specific reports or things like that. So I think this isn't we are looking at this as an iterative process, right? It's going to go in and be incorporated into the strategic plan at a super high level. It'll get incorporated into our action plan at the COC level. And I think it'll make a little bit more sense when we look at section E, which is really, I look at section E as like the implementation of the implementation plan for how these projects will have their intended function, right? So we're talking about things like coordinated entry prioritization strategies for projects. We're talking about by name case conferencing. If you don't know what that is right now, that's okay. We are planning to put a significant amount of COC lead agency resources at THN towards this initiative, should it go to award. And that would look like in-depth training, cohorts of providers for peer support, so maybe communities, community cohorts, development of local COC leadership, and the promotion of best practices. One of the things that we haven't really done before is, in the interest of promoting transparency and accountability, communicating the successes. So not just the reports themselves, but like really being able to paint the picture of like how important these funds will be to communities. I think, it's really important that these funds reduce unsheltered homelessness. HUD has said that they will be eligible for renewal, but in order to be competitive at a renewal, we're going to need to be able to demonstrate that they're effective. And so we're anticipating that this is going to be a participative process for the next 3 years for those agencies that go to award and those communities that support those agencies. I think I kind of addressed a lot of the priorities already through my rambling, but I think, again, it can be summarized in these 5 bullet points: assisting communities to develop accountability structures, replicating best practices from successful communities, using the data to adjust and demonstrate success, training, peer cohorts, and more intentional and in-depth engagement from the COC lead agency in the implementation of these funds, and then transparency. We wanted to talk a little bit about how we're planning to engage persons with lived experience. We've been doing this at the COC for a while in terms of the COC board and committees and on the independent review team. But I think that this is going to be something that we're going to need to develop. And it's something that we don't want to do just kind of recklessly, because we definitely run the risk of tokenizing people's experience. And if we are not able to create a culture where folks feel like their experience and contributions are valued, they're not going to stick around or they're not going to participate. And so this section really talks a lot more about what the COC has been doing, but we're really hoping to see deeper investment in employing persons with lived experience at the project level. We're going to continue to work to integrate people with lived experience into the governance structure through the Persons with Lived Experience work group, and encourage development of persons with lived experience compensation structure. So there should be parity, essentially, is what we're trying to say. There's a lot of really good resources on engaging persons with lived experience. And so we're going to continue to explore that through this opportunity. The last section on the plan is supporting underserved communities. And we talk a little bit about what we've done thus far with the gaps analysis and the strategic plan and coordinated entry evaluation. But I think it's important for folks to understand what underserved communities means in this context. And those are those communities that have been systematically denied a full opportunity to participate in aspects of economic, social, and civic life, right? Those are going to include folks that you could probably imagine, including Black, Latino, or Indigenous and Native American persons, but also other persons of color, LGBTQ plus community, persons with disabilities, and so on and so forth. So there's no one specific group that we're targeting with this underserved communities language, but rather, how do we do a better job about reaching folks that we're not able to reach currently? So, you know, we had to describe the underserved communities for purposes of this program, but they're varied. This might look a little bit different in your COs or in your community than it does in other parts of the state. And we really got a variety of feedback on our questions around how underserved communities engage. And so I think this is something that is going to need a little bit more attention as we go into implementation. But there are several survey responses to the strategies to provide outreach, engagement, and housing to underserved communities listed in the plan. So the priorities there are development and adoption of what we had talked about, culturally, linguistically appropriate services or class strategies to outreach, engage, and house underserved communities. So this is something that we'll be looking to adopt or adapt strategies to advance those class standards at the COC and project level. This is something that is, really common in the healthcare world. So there's a number of resources attached here about class standards and about how to create environments where that are culturally, linguistically, and appropriate service environments. That is. I feel like I just talked at y'all for like a good 45 minutes. So again, if there's any questions or people are just kind of stunned by the volume of content, I can understand that as well. But our next steps for this plan are we, are continuing to accept feedback. We plan to shut the feedback survey down on Friday. And then the plan, Mary and I will work to get that feedback incorporated into the plan. That'll go to our Persons with Lived Experience work group next week. And then once that Persons with Lived Experience work group has approved the plan, it'll go to the COC board. And then following adoption by the COC board, it will be incorporated into the strategic plan. It will also be part of the consolidated application for the supplemental NOFO. So, it won't be the last time you see this. And if you get funded under this initiative, it definitely will not be the last time that you see it. But the plan, currently we lack the capacity to implement the plan fully. However, I think that it kind of gives us a good forward direction on how we approach funding opportunities in the future. But should we get awarded, when HUD awards funds under this NOFO, it's anticipated that implementation will start in 2023, as potentially as early 2023, but more likely the second half of 2023. So I recognize that I just talked at y'all a ton. There's some additional slides. The supplemental NOFO digests on the HUD exchange are really helpful as you're thinking through, what does this look like? How do we align with these priorities? Nothing on here do we think is that out of line or out of line at all with HUD's expectations, and think it will make for a really competitive plan going into this unsheltered competition. If you have questions about any of this after this call, you can reach out to me directly, jim@thn.org or mary@thn.org. And I'm just going to take a breath and see, Craig, has there been any questions in the chat at all?
Nothing yet.
I guess I'm just going to do kind of a quick pulse check. How are folks hearing this information? Does anything in here seem like egregious to you? Have folks actually read the plan?
Jim, Mike is asking, are we anticipating a 9/11 deadline for the agency plans?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So Mike, I think what you're referencing is a proposed application. So you will not need to write your own plan. I just want to be really clear about that. If you are a project applicant, you do not need to write your own plan. What you will need to do is you will need to organize partners that you will engage in the development of a project application or applications, as it were, to respond to our request for proposals. And that has not been released yet. we're not going to release it until the board has had the opportunity to approve the plan in case there are any changes to the priorities in the plan. But that we're anticipating will be released closer to the end of the month. So what you can do right now, if you're planning on applying, is you can start engaging, for example, your PHA. Or if you're in a community where you have a relationship with a healthcare provider, that can be anything from LMH or not LMHA. Yeah, well, anything from an LMHA or a local mental health authority, all the way to a volunteer that's a licensed LMFT or marriage and family therapist or licensed clinical social worker, and start talking about what it would look like to develop relationships where they are supporting this project through service. Now, what's really important about that is it has to be additional. You can't request money from HUD and then pay those people to perform the service. HUD's looking for additional resources outside what you're requesting from them that you will leverage toward the project.
Okay, Jim, we got a couple more. Marsha's asking, it looks like this application will not open for our agency until at least winter of 2022, and the funding is in 2023. Is that right?
Yeah, it's a great question, Marcia. So the funding application is imminent. And so we're talking about like late August, early September for the application. If projects were to go to award, those announcements will not come out until 2023. That is correct. Kelly said, you said application or applications. Would there be a reason why a community might submit more than one application? That's a great question, Kelly. So a reason that a community might submit more than one, when you apply for COC program funds, you can apply for PSH plus supportive services, or rapid rehousing plus supportive services, or a standalone street outreach project. And so these things are a really big lift to get off the ground because you're still contracting with HUD. There's a fair amount of a technical aspect to all this. And so I think a community that submitted more than one application would, in my mind, would be like the LHC got together to decide, hey, Kelly, your organization is really good at street outreach. Why don't you apply for street outreach? And hey, so-and-so, your organization is really good at rapid rehousing. Why don't you apply for rapid rehousing? To kind of create a full menu, if you will, of applications in response to this. We will, and almost certainty, be limiting project applications at the agency level just because there is such a lift to get off the ground. Like someone that requested street outreach and rapid rehousing as two separate projects is going to hate their life trying to get this thing together. And it's very likely that could fail after the notice of award. And so we're hoping that by encouraging folks to focus on what they're best at, it will also encourage communication at the local level to submit a more competitive application, if that makes sense.
Jim, did you say Amanda's question?
Can you also talk about if you would be writing the grant project as one community or each agency on its own, but in collaboration with one another? That's the second, Amanda. Each agency is going to need to write their own application, but in collaboration with one another. So an example might be, my agency is going to apply for rapid rehousing, but before I apply for rapid rehousing, I'm going to talk to the local homeless coalition. I'm going to talk to the other rapid rehousing providers in town. I'm going to talk to the PHA, and then through those conversations, develop a kind of like a core group that is all aware of and bought into what's being proposed. Are we still able to incorporate street outreach into a project that focuses on rapid or transitional housing? Yes, you can. You can request street outreach as a component of a housing project. Yes. So the community plan proposal is different and separate from the grant application. That is correct. You do not need to create your own community plan. However, if your community has a strategic plan, I would love it if y'all were doing that, but it's not part of the application process. I would recommend that if an agency is eligible, that they submit their own application. Kelly, so your question is, would you have one agency apply and then another agency providing a complementary service as a subcontractor, or would both send an application for the same service? So I think I just want to clarify here. So there is a limit to the amount of activities that you can do in one project application. So for example, you could not have a rapid rehousing project that is also doing permanent supportive housing and sub out the PSH. You'd have to have one rapid application and one PSH application. I think in terms of efficiency, it makes the most sense to have one agency do rapid and one agency do PSH and one agency do street outreach as an example. Not to say that there's any advantage to doing that or anything. But if setting up subrecipient relationships, you're limited to the components in that one application. So does that make sense? No, and Amanda, you don't have to pick one. What will happen in the situation where a community submits two applications for the same component type is they will essentially be competing with one another while also competing with the remainder of the balance of state. Yeah. I know we're way over on time. I'm so sorry. If you have questions, and I'm sure you do, you can email them to myself or TXBOSCOC, and we'll get that in the chat so folks can get their draft emails started. But thank you so much for all your questions. I'm glad that I saw some positive responses to the plan so far, but the feedback is still open. So please go on and give us feedback about the plan itself, and there will be more information in the weeks to come.
Due to the timing, Daphne Adams, our COC board chair, has dropped her updates into the chat. So if you want to read that and check those out. Jim, did you see Kelly? So 9/11 is not a for sure deadline question.
No, it is right now, 9/11 is an important date for a variety of reasons.
Okay. So make sure I got everything.
Okay. Well, we still have, this is Margaret Hill. We still have about 5 minutes. So Daphne, you can read them out, or I can just tell y'all real quick. Basically the COC board nominations for seat 2 are extended. And that one is set aside for veterans experiencing homelessness, for somebody who represents veterans experiencing homelessness. So if you're interested in serving on that, the board, you can go to our website and fill out the form there before August 14th. Also the elections will be opening up on August 15th and will run through the 31st. So you will have the opportunity to vote for the board members on the 15th. And our next meeting for the general meeting is going to be on September 28th, and that will actually be at the conference, our annual conference, which will be taking place here in Austin. So you can attend in person if you will be attending the conference, or you can also attend remotely as well. We'll have it set up so you can do either. Yeah, thank y'all for being here today. And I hope that we answered some of your questions about the count and about the supplemental NOFO. And we'll stick around for a few minutes if you have any additional questions. But other than that, you are welcome to leave the meeting.
Give 5 minutes back to your day. Again, for Pitt and Hick, you can email Alex. Nofo. THM. Mary THM.
Hey, Mary, do you see Christelle's question? I don't think that Abby has submitted any feedback to the plan. I know that we reached out to all of the PHAs in our service area about this whenever it came out, but I don't think we've done any follow-up. So Abby would have gotten the initial request to participate, but nothing since then.
Yeah, no, we haven't talked with her, but we're happy to.
Yeah.
Yep.
Thanks, Alyssa. It's great to see you.
It's a lot. It is a lot.
Yeah.
It's a lot. And I apologize for that. It's a lot.
Take it one thing at a time.
Oh man, I'm telling you. I was reading something on LinkedIn about like the Navy SEALs and how they, like just decision paralysis, you know what I mean? Like when there's so many things to do, like just make a list of the most important and start at the top. But it's I related to that so hard.
Yeah.
There's a lot right now. Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you, John, for attending as well. We really appreciate y'all are on our new committee. And so thank you for coming to your meeting so quickly, this meeting so quickly after your other meeting.
Oh, did Christelle already leave? Are they with the Taylor Housing Authority? Do you know?
Christelle did step away already.
I believe she's in Williamson County.
Williamson County, okay.
Alrighty. Well, if there are no more questions, I'll go ahead and end the webinar for today so I can get this recording posted as soon as possible. Last check, last chances. All right, y'all. We'll see you next meeting. Let us know if you have any questions.
Thanks.
Thank
Bye-bye,
you.
y'all.
Bye.